Hey everyone, we're going to take a look at Standard 4 now. Standard 4 is coming after the Civil War, and we're kind of taking a step back to finish up westward expansion and then pushing on with the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era. So the transcontinental railroads. The Civil War was a turning point in the economic history of the United States. When southern states seceded from the Union, Congress lost many of its members who believed in the Jeffersonian vision of a limited government and laissez-faire economy. The Republican majority shared Hamilton's vision of an active government that would provide direct funding for internal improvements. And remember, these internal improvements are infrastructure, things like roads, bridges, and in this case, railroads and very soon canals. The federal government sought to encourage the settlement of the West and used land grants to encourage Western settlement and economic development. The federal government owned and still owns most of the land in the West and passed legislation aimed at populating and developing the West. So they were giving away this land to individuals to settle, as well as to companies to build things like railroads. So the first act that does this, we have the Homestead Act. People are, of course, trying to build homesteads. So this act provided Western settlers with 160-acre parcels of land for free as long as they improved and developed it. So basically, as long as they built a homestead, built a farm, built a ranch, and worked it. Next, we've got the Pacific Railway Act. It granted land subsidies to corporations involved in building a transcontinental railroad. So transcontinental meaning across the continent from the eastern United States to the western United States. So the Transcontinental Railroad linked the eastern and western United States and helped to create a national market. So what that means is we've got freer trade or easier trade between the East Coast and the West Coast. So from the West Coast, we're getting natural resources. And they're being transported to the eastern United States. And those natural resources are being turned into manufactured goods. And these manufactured goods are then being sold and transported to the western United States. So the government-led development did not come without a price. Corporations schemed to get as much government money as possible, with some even resorting to fraud. Okay, subjugation of the Western Indian tribes. So the Plains Indians depended on buffalo herds as their primary source of food. Unfortunately, buffalo herds and railroads cannot coexist. The railroad companies hired men like Buffalo Bill Cody to shoot bison in order to clear the way and to feed railroad workers. The Plains Indians were forced to live on reservations, often away from their ancestral lands. These lands often had gold and silver deposits. These Indians, unable to hunt for food, became dependent on the federal government, which took advantage of them. So an example of this is the Dawes Act. It took Indian lands away from the tribes and gave parcels to individual Indian families in return for U.S. citizenship. The goal of the Dawes Act was to encourage the assimilation of Native Americans, basically to get them to adopt mainstream American culture, to assimilate them into American culture. Boarding schools such as the Carlisle Indian School were founded with this same goal in mind. So with the Carlisle Indian Schools, young Native Americans were taken away from their families, away from their tribes, and sent to these boarding schools where they learned American culture and English and Christianity. Many Native Americans resisted, resulting in a series of Indian wars launched by the U.S. government. The Wounded Knee Massacre was the last major armed encounter between the Native Americans and U.S. cavalry. Now we're moving on to the new immigrants. In the late 19th and early 20th century, the United States was flooded with millions of new immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, which included countries such as Italy, Russia, and Poland. Okay? Native-born Americans tended to resent the new immigrants for several reasons. Now, when I say native-born Americans, I'm not talking about Native Americans. These are white Americans who were born in the United States. So they resented the new immigrants for several reasons. First, they didn't understand English, so most of them did not speak English. They spoke another language. Their home countries lacked traditions of republican government, so they were coming from countries that had, monarchs, some sort of emperor, something like that. Their religions were different, so we've got Catholics, Orthodox Christians, and then Jewish people. They were largely alien to native-born Americans, meaning that they weren't very familiar, or at least didn't have positive images of these different religions. So Catholics and Orthodox Christians, both of those are types of Christians, but they are different than the dominant sect of Christianity that's in the United States, Protestants. Okay? And then, of course, Jewish people, they are not Christians. They provided a steady supply of cheap labor, which undermined efforts by labor unions to get better wages. So these immigrants worked for less than what most native-born Americans wanted to work for. Catholicism and cheap labor were also reasons why people resented the Irish immigrants during the antebellum period. However, the Irish did speak English and had traditions of republican government, so no efforts were made by Congress to limit Irish immigration during the 19th century. Anti-immigrant legislation and quotas. So in the 1880s, we get the Chinese Exclusion Act, the first legislation to prohibit immigration by people of a specific nationality. Laws restricting immigration from Asia remain on the books until the World War II era. Immigration Quota Acts of the 1920s severely limited immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, giving preference to immigrants from the British Isles and Germany. So basically what that means is because of the quota, only a certain number of immigrants from each country were allowed in, and countries in Southern and Eastern Europe had smaller quotas, had smaller numbers that the U.S. would let in than, say, Western countries like England, Germany, France, those places. Ethnic neighborhoods and immigrant poverty. In most cases, immigrants were too poor to move beyond coastal cities, leading to the rise of densely populated ethnic neighborhoods. Immigrants relied on political machines led by party bosses to help them find jobs. The political machines relied on immigrant votes to keep themselves in power. So the most famous of these political machines was Tammany Hall in New York, and it was led by the political boss there, Boss Tweed. Muckrakers such as Jacob Riis, author of How the Other Half Lives, exposed the poor conditions in urban tenements, low-rent apartments, and sweatshops, where immigrants performed cheap labor. Although most immigrants stayed in coastal cities, such as New York City, many went to Chicago and other cities in the Midwest, where low-paying, undesirable jobs, like in the meatpacking industry, were available. Upton Sinclair's The Jungle exposed the wretched working conditions in Chicago's meatpacking industry. So the settlement house movement, Jane Addams started the Hull House, a settlement house where immigrant families could go to receive education, job training, and child care, amongst other things. Settlement houses served as community centers for immigrants trying to make their way in America. So this was kind of like a charity that Jane Addams started to help immigrants assimilate, but also kind of get a start in America. So the progressive presidents, Teddy Roosevelt, before Teddy Roosevelt was elected president, the federal government had tended to side with big business when there were conflicts between business and labor. He's talking about labor unions. Roosevelt offered Americans a square deal. He called it a square deal because he thought it was fair to all sides, or equal for all sides, like a square, promising to stand up to corporations who didn't play fairly. One example of this is the anthracite coal strike, the first attempt by a president to end a strike by commission. Basically, he was telling the coal company that they needed to look at some of the demands of their workers and improve conditions. Teddy Roosevelt earned the reputation as a trust buster for prosecuting corporations who flagrantly violated the principles of the Sherman Antitrust Act. So if you guys remember when we talked about the Gilded Age, how these companies were consolidating power, using things like monopolies, and that's what we mean by a trust. However, it became apparent that the Sherman Antitrust Act was not strong enough to rein in monopolies. So some progressive legislation passed during Roosevelt's administration. We've got the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906, and that creates the Food and Drug Administration. Okay, and that's supposed to, make sure we know what's in our food and in our medicines, and that they are safe. Next is the Meat Inspection Act, also in 1906. This was prompted by Upton Sinclair's publication of The Jungle. So Teddy Roosevelt read The Jungle and was disgusted by what he read in it, and helped pass this legislation to clean up the meatpacking industry. Okay, conservation of wildlife and natural resources was something that Teddy Roosevelt's well known for. He implemented things like national parks, and reserves to try to preserve and conserve America's natural resources and our wilderness. Progressive legislation passed during Woodrow Wilson's administration. So with Woodrow Wilson, we get the Clayton Antitrust Act. It strengthened the Sherman Antitrust Act. We have child labor legislation declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. This is an example of judicial review. And then the Federal Reserve Act. So this creates a central banking system that could regulate the money supply and interest rates. And this is still the same national bank that we have today, the Federal Reserve. Constitutional amendments ratified during the Progressive Era. During the Progressive Era, 4 amendments were proposed by a 2/3 vote of Congress and ratified by 3/4 of the states. These amendments were products of the goals of progressives' popular governments. So just like popular sovereignty, having more voice in the government, more power to the people, an expanded role for the federal government, so giving the federal government more power than, say, the state governments to do things like regulate. And then finally, social reforms, changing the way people believe and behave. One example of that's prohibition. So we get the 16th Amendment, which implements a graduated federal income tax. All right, so we're taxing people's income, and the fact that it's graduated is important because that means that people aren't necessarily taxed the same. They're taxed based on how much they make. So a very wealthy person is going to be taxed more than, say, someone with very little. Okay, the 17th Amendment, we get the direct election of U.S. senators. And what that means is that the people of the states actually get to elect their senators. Before the 17th Amendment, state legislatures appointed their senators, their state senators. Well, now that's being moved to the people, which is part of that popular government expanding the power of the people. The 18th Amendment is the prohibition of alcohol. So it was now illegal to sell, buy, or consume alcohol. This led to, of course, bootlegging and speakeasies like we've talked about, and organized crime, and it was finally repealed by the 21st Amendment. Okay, and then the final progressive era amendment is going to be the 19th Amendment, which is women's suffrage. Remember, suffrage is the right to vote. Okay, I hope this was helpful.